Okay, we'll go ahead and get started. Third week, spiritual life in a disenchanted world. So hopefully the online folks have got this down by now. Let's see if I can get this to go. Okay, why are you not working? Okay. Just a reminder, people were talking about this when you were coming in. The classes are being recorded, which we heard the little owl say a moment ago. That's what the name of this thing is, the owl. And they are on the YouTube channel. So if you just go to YouTube and put in Country Club Christian Church, you'll see all kinds of categories. But one of them is these classes. So you can look for that. We're not meeting next Monday, but 2 weeks from tonight, David May, and some of you know from the trip to Israel and from teaching classes here, and my best friend is going to do one on archaeology called the Pick and Trail, Archaeology of the Biblical World. And he's always interesting. And then, I don't know if you remember, but we had this sermon series a while back, Christianity 101, and Carl and I arm wrestled, not really, figuratively, over what should be included in that. And so the more I thought about it, I thought, well, this is a class. So we're going to continue the conversation about what are the essentials of Christianity, what are the different versions of Christianity that exist out there. There's so many, it's crazy. So anyway, that'll be in a couple of weeks. And just by way of review, I don't think we need one at this point, but what comes to mind when I say forest? And of course, we talked about how people talk about trees and paths and the cost of lumber and whatever it is. But 500 years ago, or even before that, people thought more in terms of magic. They thought in terms of demons. They obviously in their own world thought about robbers. The world was enchanted. And of course now we just think about taking care of the forest. So Taylor, who's kind of been our textbook, so to speak, he asked the question, how come it was that in 1500 everybody believed in God? I mean, it was just a given. How could it be that 500 years later, granted that's a long time, that would only be an option? It would just be one possibility among others. And his real question, though, is how do we go from an enchanted world to a disenchanted one? So here's just the briefest of reviews. The first week, we talked about this map of the forest of bearings. Where are we? How did we get here? How did that 500-year thing happen? How did our ancestors, it boggles my brain, but they believed that if you'd snuck the bread out or the little cup of juice out yesterday from the service, taken it home, it could have healed a sick animal, you could have helped your crops, whatever it is. How did we go from that to where we are now, where we would just kind of shake our head and say, oh my gosh, can you believe that somebody would believe that? Well, that's the first question we wrestled with. The second one last week is what's the lay of the land? What is it like to live here? And I just kind of identified 4 areas. One, that we're desensitized to transcendence, the idea that there's a high ceiling in this world, that God is present, active in the world. Second one, substituting artificial forms of faith, the demise of critical thinking, and then the technology of pace of life that are undoing us. We're only going to focus on 2 of those tonight, I'll just tell you that. So tonight we're doing the third week, which is compass. Where are we headed? How do we get there? So this is kind of we've got to get our bearings to figure out where we're going. So just opening it up, see if there's any reflections. What have been your reflections since last week? What sticks with you? I think this question came up last week. Does a Christian have to view the world as enchanted? What do we mean by that term? That would be an important distinction. And then we just brainstorm a few strategies, which is more of what we're going to focus on tonight. So it's just your invitation to see if anything's sort of still sticking with you and you've been chewing on it. Yeah.
What always comes to me is the demise of critical thinking.
The demise of I'm repeating this because I realize people on there with us masks can't always hear. So
the demise of critical thinking, which seems to be, to me, encouraged by technology and the need for instant response.
Right.
We don't, we don't want to wait. We don't want to process anything. And
Right.
I think from my perspective, it diminishes all parts of life.
So if you didn't hear that, she's talking about the demise of critical thinking, which is kind of an interesting two sides to the coin. Technology makes us lazy. You don't have to memorize anything. You can just look it up on Google. But at the same time, you think about going from an enchanted world to a disenchanted world is, I'm smarter than that. I don't believe in those superstitions of those fairies in the forest. So it's a really interesting move to where we are. We live in our brain, but our brain's not what it used to be because technology is a substitute brain.
But we're not so smart not to believe everything we see on Google. Oh, I saw it on the internet.
Right. Yeah, so yeah, that's true. That's true.
This may be way out left field, and I've been so wrong so many times. But I started thinking today of the Christian mystery of the incarnation of Christ. Is that enchantment?
Okay.
Or is Christian mystery the mystery of faith, the mystery of reincarnation, all this?
Right. Okay, so the question was, is believing in the incarnation, is that a form of enchantment? Well, I'm going to give you another example here in a minute too, the resurrection. Well, so it'd be pretty hard for a thinking person to deny that there was a historical person named Jesus. The historical record's pretty good about that. But the incarnation says, well, that's the Son of God come down in the form of a human. That's a different step than the first one. The first one's a historical step. The second one's a theological step. Some people would say, it's a great story, not historically accurate. Here's a Jewish person who tries to figure out who he is, comes to think of himself as a child of God, maybe the Son of God, but doesn't necessarily think of himself as having some preconceived eternal home kind of thing. So if you were to say, well, I think it's the Son of God come down, that's an enchanted worldview. But others could say, well, I don't subscribe to that theory, but this one who comes to wrestle with his identity and then heals and does all these things, that's an enchanted worldview. So it's a nuanced kind of view of enchantment. But probably that, like the question, does a Christian have to view the world as enchanted? Well, the fact if you call yourself a Christian, you believe in God, right away you've entered an enchanted worldview. Because a disenchanted worldview would say, no, you believe there's a God? I mean, seriously? So it's almost like if you took Taylor's secular 1, secular 2, secular 3, maybe there's a disenchanted and enchanted 1, 2, and 3, kind of gradations on a scale, on a spectrum. Yeah.
Well, and I mean, for me, I don't have any problem believing Jesus is the Son of God, as long as I can also believe Mike is the Son of God. And Greg is the Son of God.
Right. So no difference between.
Well, not necessarily no difference, but because I think, I like the thin places analogy.
Yeah.
And I think that Jesus had a much better thin place than most of the rest of us.
I got you.
But
yeah.
I think that we are all sons and daughters of God.
Right. Yeah, and so that's an example of nuanced shades of enchantment. You don't have to, enchantment doesn't have to mean that you also believe there's fairies in the forest, right? Okay, anyone else? Well, we got a lot of ground to cover. So, okay, this is a story I think I've told before, but David May, my best friend, is going to teach this class. He was going to a professional meeting in Atlanta. He took the MARTA because he'd memorized this thing, go to the such and such stop, and then walk this many blocks to your hotel. And he got lost. And so he saw this woman, she was at a bus stop, and he said, I'm trying to get to the blah, blah, blah. And she said, oh, my poor friend, you are so lost. And that was all she offered. You are so lost. Well, if we're thinking about compass, and we're thinking about what are the strategies, we've come to week 3, what are the strategies for living a spiritual life in this kind of world? It's not a whole lot of help to just tell somebody, you're lost. You kind of want somebody who says, oh, you're so lost, let me show you where to go. But as I've been saying, Taylor, Smith, all these people, if they write 800 pages, 795 of them are critique. And then a couple of paragraphs, a couple of pages that pretty much start with the phrase, I really don't know what to tell you, but here's kind of my thinking, which is famous for scholars. They say, I don't know, and then they keep talking, right? So they're not a whole lot of help here. And I'm probably in the same boat. I'm not a whole lot of help, but I'm going to try. It also reminded me of a story when I was in sabbatical in London. I was told to expect this, but I had to laugh when it happened, although I was pretty close to crying. I've got the 3 little kids, we're on sabbatical, we're making our way through the underground, we're trying to get on the tube to go to wherever. And I asked this Bobby, this British policeman, could you give me directions? We're trying to go to, and I'll just make this up, to Jubilee Station. And he starts into like the 10 steps of how to get to Jubilee. I'm trying to memorize it. Good. And I think I've got it. And he says, and he goes through another 7 steps. I'm like, there's no way this is going to be of any help. But I have been told that's what they will do when they give you directions. They will give you 2 sets, which is pretty much useless as far as I'm concerned, unless you are writing it down. I think among the many possibilities, some options are better than others. And the one that I've just listed here is in the book of Revelation, chapter 18. John has this list of cargo. Okay, hang in there for a second. He has a list of cargo, and I do mean cargo. And the first thing on the list is gold. And then there are all these precious things. And the last thing on the list is human lives, which were basically slaves. And his advice to the saints in the Mediterranean world in roughly the year 100 is you should come out. He calls it Babylon. It's just code for Rome. We're living in the Roman Empire. This is not the kingdom of God. This is the Roman Empire. This is the empire of God, or the empire of Rome. You should come out of that. You should just totally not live in that. Well, and how are we going to do that? I mean, yeah, sure, he's an exiled prisoner on an island. He's come out of it, but he's an exile. I don't think that strategy, now I don't know literally what he means there, but I don't think the strategy that some Christians have said, if you want to live a spiritual life in a world like this, disenchanted world, you need to just get out of it. Now, there are monasteries and so forth. We can choose to do that, but most of us aren't going to take that option. So I don't find that to be all that helpful. Harmut Rosa, that I noted last week, he says that what happens when cultures change, the rapid pace of change in technology, is they resist it at first, but eventually they just kind of give in. So you can say, well, I'm not going to give in to a technological age. Okay, good luck. It's going to be hard. Good luck. Did I see a hand?
Well, is that supposed to come out of here or come out of here?
Yeah. Well, it's actually a little bit of both, because he actually refers to her as a woman, but it is her. Yeah. Yeah, he calls it the whore of Babylon.
Okay,
That's his code for the Roman Empire.
okay.
Okay, so where do we want to go? Well, our telos, our goal, should be flourishing. Remember, we talked about that last week. So here's the 2 areas we're going to focus on. Being somehow resensitized to transcendence. Or another way of saying it would be, how could we capture the enchantment again? Is that possible? And the second one is it possible to live a different pace of life? Now, both of those might sound like, oh, you just told us to get out of this world. But I'm not a monk. I don't live in a monastery. And so I think these are realistic goals, but they're also very countercultural because it's hard to do it. I try to do both. Try really hard, actually. By the way, the word resensitized does not appear in the dictionary, which is kind of interesting to me. Okay, so sensitized is a word, and we may desensitize the word. So you can become desensitized, and it's in the dictionary. But if you want to be resensitized, well, forget it. It's not even a word, which just sort of tells you this is how hard it is, that we don't even have the word.
But we can make it.
Well, we can.
Let's just do it.
Yeah. Well, you just put quotation marks around it, and the spell checker will leave you alone. But I love this quote from Picasso. It took me 4 years to paint like Raphael, but a lifetime to paint like a child. So I tend to think of it as recapturing the innocence of childhood, but not exactly. Because the innocence of childhood, well, you can't recapture that because you're an educated person and you're a person experienced in the world. So, I mean, I watched out my window today as the little 25 3-year-olds marched around and they're just, it's a transcendent world. I can't get there, but is there some way to capture some of that even as an adult? So that's what I'm thinking. So Paul Ricoeur, obviously he's a playful person since he put his glasses on, so he famously described 3 stages of appreciating ancient myths. First, naivete. So that's the kids walking around looking at the leaves. It's childlike innocence. Myths are at face value. But in between that and where we are now is a thing called education. Anybody go to school? You went to 1st grade, 2nd grade. It just slowly becomes unenchanted. Kindergarten's pretty enchanted. 6th grade's not enchanted. And it just happens over time. 11th grade's less enchanted. College is less enchanted. The world is less enchanted. So we ask hard questions, we grow up, whatever you want to call it. But Ricoeur says there is this thing called second naivete. So it's an informed, there aren't fairies in the forest. They're informed. But is there something still kind of mystical about forests? If you don't just think about board feet, you don't, just think that way. If you are entranced by the colors of the leaves and the way they fall or whatever. So I mentioned earlier when Steve asked the question about the incarnation, the resurrection is a good example. For some people, the resurrection of Jesus is a literal historical thing. And for others, it's the best story ever told, but it's not literally true. So those are different ways of going about the same thing. I mean, the same idea of resurrection. So I don't know. I mean, I'm kind of curious what you're thinking here. I mean, jump in if you want to. I'm going to keep moving, but yeah.
Well, one of the major questions is how one treats the Bible.
Yeah.
Is it the true and inerrant Word of God, or is it something for each person to decide?
Right.
Or is it metaphor?
Yeah, and so I mean that's
what I mean. For
Yeah,
each person to observe.
yeah. We can't chase that rabbit, obviously, because we're talking about a major topic. But it is a good example of how people bring different things to scripture, to religion, to the world. Enchanted, disenchanted.
I have come to think about things in terms of, for instance, the virgin birth or the physical resurrection of whether it's a metaphorical story or whether it was actually true, what difference does that make to how I should live my life?
Mhm.
And I've come to the conclusion in most cases, it doesn't.
Right,
That the end goal of love your neighbor
yeah.
and love God is still the same.
Which is a good example of a disenchanted worldview, because in an enchanted worldview, they
I
never
don't
would
want
ask.
to be enchanted.
Do what?
No.
You know what I'm saying, though, that
Yes.
500 years ago, that's not on the table.
No,
That is not on the table for discussion. 500 years later, it's on the table, which is just an example of how the culture has shifted, at least in some places. It's not true everywhere. When we're talking about the West, and even there, you have to differentiate pockets of it. So here's some suggestions for re-sensitizing. I always like this Norman Rockwell piece. I don't know if you remember this one, but this was on the cover of the Saturday Evening Post, and the people are in Manhattan passing by the church. The priest is watching as the guy puts up the sermon title for this week, and it's called Lift Up Thine Eyes. And everybody is, of course, I'm reading into it, a little bit forlorn, or at least ragged, but nobody's looking up, everybody's looking down. And by the way, there's some artist has done a kind of remake of this with the same sort of image of a church and the sermon title, but everybody's on their phone looking down.
Have you seen the photograph of the kids in the museum? I forget which one it is, that's the
Yes.
Night Watch. And there's this masterpiece, and they're all sitting there.
Yeah.
I like to think that they're listening to a little audio about it.
Yeah, well, you can
It's
think,
a variation on that same thing.
right. And I've probably mentioned this before, but Annie Dillard and her Pilgrim in Tinker Creek, which won a Pulitzer, she talks about how when she was a kid, she would hide pennies and then draw chalk lines to tell people where to find them. And then she kind of has this punchline. She says, what adult stops for a penny now on the sidewalk? You stop for a penny.
People all the time.
There you go.
That's good luck.
Well, you have an enchanted worldview. You're resensitized.
I've made $1.50 in the last 2 weeks finding money on the sidewalk.
Wow, you're doing well.
If I see something, I'm going to see my friend.
Working on a college campus, it was easy to change.
I'm sure.
Really unimportant to college.
I'm sure. And then there was this article in the Christian Century recently in which this woman actually was starting a sabbatical, and she found this book in Target. But her whole premise of talking about her sabbatical and paying attention and slowing down and everything was really to say how the devices, for instance, are built on these mathematical equations, right? The what we call them, the algorithms. And the algorithms, if you're scanning the news feed and you click on this, well, it starts feeding you more of those, right? I mean, they know how to get our attention. And I go on and I'm looking at golf clubs and I'm looking at some dress shirts and some bow ties. And the next thing you know, when I do a Google search for the National Cathedral, there in the corner are those dress shirts. Well, isn't that interesting? So, yeah. But I love this idea. Smith, he's the one that wrote that little book, How Not to Be Secular. He says some people, they walk through life and there's a kind of a brass ceiling over them. And others, there's a skylight. And, of course, you see the image that he's using there is that the transcendent, enchanted kind of worldview says, yeah, I know there's a ceiling, I get that, but I'm kind of open to some kind of mystery and sacramental ideas that can be around us. Another one, I really believe that reading poetry can do it. So I brought you 2 examples. If you like Mary Oliver, she's probably my favorite. And the title of this one actually is Alligator Point, which tells you something, right? Okay, so here it is. I knelt down at the edge of the water, and if the white birds standing in the tops of the trees whistled any warning, I didn't understand. I drank up to the very moment it came crashing toward me, its tail flailing like a bundle of swords, slashing the grass and the inside of its cradle-shaped mouth gaping and rimmed with teeth. And that's how I almost died of foolishness in beautiful Florida. But I didn't. I leaped aside and fell, and it streamed past me, crushing everything in its path as it swept down to the water and threw itself in. And in the end, this isn't a poem about foolishness, but about how I rose from the ground and saw the world as if for the second time, the way it really is. The water, that circle of shattered glass, healed itself with a slow whisper and lay back with the backlit light of polished steel. And the birds in the endless waterfalls of the trees shook open the snowy pleats of their wings and drifted away, while for a keepsake and to steady myself, I reached out. I picked the wildflowers from the grass around me, blue stars and blood-red trumpets on long green stems, for hours in my trembling hands that glittered like fire. I would assume a near-death experience with an alligator could do that. Hopefully you don't need that kind of a warning. And then Wendell Berry, this one's called Look It Over. I leave behind even my walking stick. My knife is in my pocket, but that I forgot. I bring no car, no cell phone, no computer, no camera, no CD player, no fax, no TV, not even a book. I go into the woods. I sit on a log provided at no cost. It is the earth I've come to, the earth itself, sadly abused by the stupidity only humans are capable of, but as ever itself, free. Bargain. Get it while it lasts. I just think, what I would call sacramental poetry, poetry that's very normal but full of sacredness, kind of the way bread and wine, or you can buy it at Trader Joe's, and yet it's got a sacredness to it. I just think that kind of poetry can sort of help us. Yeah.
So when I go to work every day, I'm literally inside instead of the building, nowhere near window, there's nothing all day long. On the way in, I listen to podcasts and stuff, and I listen to one a lot. It's called Poetry Unbound. As I'm driving downtown and, the sun's coming up over the buildings, it looks a little bit like I'm in somebody's dollhouse sometimes. But each one of those is about 15 to 17 minutes. And it's amazing to me how much richness I can get from that to take me to the end of the day, honestly.
Poetry
and keep me
Unbound.
feeling less trapped.
Yeah.
Once I'm there.
I have on my wish list, not that I can't afford it, I just haven't gotten to it yet, a book called 100 Poems to Break Your Heart. Have you all heard of that one? It's supposed to be just an amazing collection. Another one, Marita mentioned this earlier, this notion of thin places. So it's a Celtic proverb, heaven and earth are only 3 feet apart, but in the thin places, that distance is even smaller. So this is the moments usually called epiphanies, where you're watching a movie and you go, oh my gosh, it just touched me, or a passage in a novel, or as somebody in staff last week was saying, they were at a cross-country meet and their daughter had already finished, the team's ready to leave, but they noticed this other girl who's almost walking, and everybody gathers and cheers her on. And it was for her an epiphany, it was a kind of a religious moment. So in some ways, just paying attention to those. When I taught a class at the seminary, believe it or not, I taught a class called Preaching and the Movies. And we would watch a movie like Places in the Heart or Amadeus or whatever. And the first question I would ask is, was there a scene or two that just moved you, it just touched you? And then you would have to try and put into words, why did it touch you? And that's kind of a way of paying attention to the thin places. Like if a poem while you're driving touches you, just kind of contemplating what that is. So anyway, something to think about. Okay, so what do you think about this notion of second naivete? And do the suggestions so far seem practical, impractical? Can you think of other ideas for kind of recapturing a nuanced naivete?
I think the closest I've gotten is to learn not to destroy my grandchildren's naivete. Like when
So
they-
how are you, so in case you didn't hear that, she's talking about not destroying a grandchild's naivete.
Well, when they have a wonderful grandiose idea, and I could think of all the reasons why it wouldn't work, I'm learning not to say that,
Yeah.
because they'll figure it out soon enough, you know,
Right.
but maybe it will work, or maybe part of it will work or something.
Mhm.
During the last school year, I was online coach for my goddaughter, 4 days a week, she's in the 4th grade. And during that time, I learned a lot about the new app, which is and, but I also heard children talk about wishes and hopes and dreams and plans.
Say that again?
I heard children talk about wishes and hopes and plans and dreams.
Yeah.
And that restored, I didn't think of it as a second naivete, but it certainly gave me a different view than when I left after those 4 hours every day of how the different perspective I had on my work. And right now, helping people who are desperately impacted by COVID get rent assistance and utility assistance, and understanding their struggle has brought great joy.
Well, that leads into the next one that we're going to talk about. It's really interesting to bring that up. I mean, I'll just tell you now, but we'll get to it. But Root, who wrote that 3-volume set, he says that one of the ways, well, first of all, they say there is no way to slow it down. That ship has sailed and it's a spaceship and it's going to be going 18 million miles an hour. But he says one thing you can do is invest yourself in justice, social justice. And he says that makes a difference. I'll show you in just a second. Okay, so I really like this book, In Praise of Slowness. It's part of the slow movement. Carl Honore, he uses this Italian phrase, tempo giusto, the right pace. So proponents of the slow movement actually would say they're not naive. So they use this phrase, be fast, and it makes sense to be fast, and be slow, and slowness is called for. Well, I don't think knowing how to go fast is our problem. We're pretty good at that. So we're going to think about how do you counter the speed of technology. And I realize that is a major uphill climb. No telling how many emails I answered today. Okay. First one is find empty time for contemplation. So the empty time, Honore tells this story that the dean of Harvard, at least when he wrote the book, wrote a letter to the freshmen. And this was one of the lines in it. Empty time is not a vacuum to be filled. It's the thing that enables the other things on your mind to be creatively rearranged. Like the empty square in the 4x4 puzzle that makes it possible to move the other 15 pieces around. And it's actually a really beautiful long letter to the freshmen saying, you got in here because you've got drive. And this one freshman at orientation, this is what actually led to him to do this, said something like, you had a listening session with the students somewhere in their freshman year. Any problems, complaints? What do you? And one of them said, well, my advisor won't let me take 22 hours of credits. And he, answered him, but he went back to his office and he said, it's not the advisor who's got a problem here. It's the student who's got a problem here. Even if he's capable of it, he's got a problem here. And so he writes this open letter that, at least at the time, I don't know if it's still true, went out to all the freshmen that basically said, you might want to enjoy the journey here. So, kind of goes along with what we were talking about last week of reflective, critical thinking. And I use this in the Life Worth Living, but I always like this story. So Barbara tells the story. When she was still teaching freshmen, sophomores in college, and she would get them into a bragging contest. How many things can you do at once? And of course, somebody said, I can do 5 things at once. Somebody else, 6 things. And then she passed out the little box of raisins, and you were only given 1, and you put it in your mouth, and you just let it sit there for a long time until she finally said, now start sucking on it. And then eventually you could bite it, and then eventually chew it. And they were transfixed. The idea of multitasking, lots of stuff been written on this, but what about single tasking? What about focused one thing, I'm just going to give myself to this one thing? But here's what Root says, going back to what Vicki said. And I'm paraphrasing. He says, an epiphany makes a difference. Okay, so that's that. Reading the novel or at the children's soccer game, and you have this kind of religious moment, whatever you want to call it, but it has to be followed with action. You have to do something. Okay, so he's not just wanting you to have a warm fuzzy. And for him, because this is his area of expertise, children and youth and families, he puts all of his eggs in that basket. So if you read that 3rd volume, The Congregation of the Secular Age, the whole thing, what he's eventually going to say is, we should be investing in the youth. Not because they're the future of the church, they're the present of the church. They're the real thing. And they have something to teach us, and we can invest ourselves in. But I think that's a little bit narrow to only invest in that. I mean, I love this quote from Adorno. To think of progress in the crudest, most basic terms, that no one should go hungry anymore. There should be no more torture, no more Auschwitz. If you want a definition of progress, that's his definition. So if someone says, I remember when the guy would deliver a block of ice and you put it in the box, it was called an ice box. And now my refrigerator's got a computer and I tell it what I need to get at the store this week and it knows when I'm getting low on milk. He would say, well, yeah, that's great, but how many people are hungry in the world? For him, progress is justice. So Root's kind of thing, I think is really interesting. Even if you don't just do it with youth and children and so forth, but one way to battle technology is to do something in the world, to do something that matters in the world. And he offers that as a kind of countering of it. And it could be you're using technology to do it even, but that's his premise, which I think is, worth exploring. Postman, he's got a long list, and I found 4 of them to be kind of worth putting up here. 1, refuse to accept efficiency as the goal of human relations. 2nd, don't regard calculation as a substitute for judgment. He points out, for instance, and this will just be so obvious to all of us disenchanted people, GPA. Somebody somewhere at some point came up with a numerical system to measure your intelligence. And they did it on a scale of 4.0, or they did it on a scale of 0 to 100. You wrote this essay, you took this math quiz, you got a 96. You are worth 96%. You got a 69, you're worth 69%. And we live in that world. He says, but you can't do that. You can't say this person's 69%. He says, we've put numbers on stuff that when it was first proposed, people said, how could you do that? Don't confuse information with understanding. Kind of goes back to what we were talking about all these Google searches. And then don't regard the aged as irrelevant.
I like that.
I really like, refuse to accept efficiency as a goal of human relations, because for a time in social work, 30 years ago, there was a shift to measuring everything with a definable goal. And it is important for people to make progress to move themselves forward. But people cannot be judged based on their accumulation of talent or skills or acquisition of things.
Right.
If we try to turn social work into a production value, and it backfired tremendously in the privatization of adoption, of welfare systems, of hospitalization. It's ruined our ability to observe. Calculation is not a substitute.
Yeah, totally agree. Postman, I mean, Root, I already mentioned this, but for him, any ministry that gets us, outside of ourselves, does something for someone else. He also has this interesting thing about, as with Moses and God, the encounter of the burning bush, God says Moses' name, but also by the end gives God's name. It says, my name's Yahweh, the I am one. And they have an encounter of their stories. Their stories come together. And for Ruth, this kind of becomes a paradigm of the importance of knowing the name of somebody and listening to their story. Not just what happens in the Moses, but everybody's name and story. So tell me your name. What's your story? And that, he says, is a way to get outside of the impersonalization of technology and the pace that comes with it. And then he calls this the jujitsu move, which I guess in jujitsu, they're using the opponent's weight against themselves. That's the kind of trick of jujitsu. So he says, if disenchanted worldview says, well, there's no such thing as God, well, then let's honestly name what are the places we feel the absence of God. So you would name the places where there are injustices and suffering in the world. You'd honestly name those instead of pretending. Kind of like when we talked about that continuum where there's a Christian group that says, oh, there's an explanation for everything. Don't wrestle with the evil in the world. And he says, no, you should be able to name the evil. You should be able to name the struggles that you have. So an enchanted worldview for him is not first naivete, it's second naivete. And that critical consciousness is you name the suffering, but it doesn't mean you don't still have some kind of sense of trust or mystery or whatever. I got a couple ideas on my own here. One is the Wesleyan Quadrilateral. That's one of the names it goes by. That we have these quadrants. We use scripture. So we turn to Moses in Exodus chapter 3, and we look at that story. But we also have tradition. So how's that been interpreted over the years? And what does your church say? And what did your parents say? That's tradition. But then we also have reason and experience. And in some ways, the difference between enchanted and disenchanted could pit reason against experience, right? But I don't think it has to. I think there's a way to navigate using all four of the quadrants so that you're reading scripture, but you can use your brain, but just because you use your brain doesn't mean you couldn't enter into the mystery of a story that you enjoyed so much as a kid. So it's kind of moving around in the quadrants. And I think, this thing's smart in a lot of levels, but one of the things that's really interesting is everybody uses all four. It's just one or two of those is so dominant for each of us individually. We're all different. And some of us do two of these, but we do the two of them through the other one that got us there, you know, so everybody's got their own kind of home base of the quadrants. Then the other one that I don't know exactly, I'm still trying to get my brain around this one. I like this, but I don't like this. So in the book Table Talk, I mentioned this, I may have said it before in a sermon or a Bible study. One of the ways that theologians have started thinking about God is not up, but out on the horizon, where the sky and the earth meet, which means God's kind of among us, but still out there. Now, the whole idea of God being up is something we invented. We didn't, you know, that just what we weren't born knowing that. So if that's a construct, it's a way of thinking of God being up, then so is God being out on the horizon, the way of thinking. But while I like it, because it says, well, what if God is closer to us than we realize? Is it possible that by bringing God on the horizon, that we'll lose some of the transcendence, that will almost become buddy-buddy? And so it's that kind of eminence, transcendence thing that I was talking about last week. I told you I don't have my head totally wrapped around it, but you can respond or not respond, whatever you're.
I have to say, I don't think of either one of those. I think of God as surrounding me, and almost like a placenta that you draw strength and nourishment from, but it's still something we don't quite understand.
Well, and a question would be is, yeah, I mean, a lot of people have all kinds of metaphors.
I'm sort of a visual person, so I.
Yeah, no, but so one of the questions they would press you on would be, is this placenta any different than any other placenta? Or is this, you know, like how lofty is this God? How all, whatever it is, powerful, knowing, whatever, or is it totally that close to us? You know, in other words, they're talking about transcendence, this distance, and eminence, this nearness. And it sounds like placenta puts a lot of emphasis on the nearness. And so what theologians wrestle with is, if you emphasize transcendence, well, then you've lost nearness. And if you emphasize nearness, you've lost transcendence. And so that's why everybody's trying to figure it out. But yeah, I mean, there's no answer, obviously.
So much work with language and translating different parts of scripture. You mentioned, you know, we have the idea of up, well, it's in the Lord's Prayer. So have you done a lot of work about what the Lord's Prayer actually says?
Yeah.
You go back and back and back.
Yeah, I have, but you know.
Does it always go up?
Where does it say that?
Well, the biblical is,
Heaven.
yeah, the heavens.
It says
The
it's
heavens.
up.
In their cosmology, the heavens are up. But that's a cosmology of theirs.
But
That,
that's the authors?
well,
Or
Jesus inherits that cosmology. He's born a Jew, and this is the way Jews think. God in the heavens. It's the way you think.
But so much of what we think is based on language that is inaccurately translated over
Right.
centuries.
By the way, the New Revised Standard, which is still the gold standard, it's in our pews, et cetera, is being released a new version this November. I will get my hands on it when I'm in San Antonio at the conference, and I can't wait to see it because I hear it's pretty amazing. I don't know, you know, what that
What
means
is it
for.
gonna be called?
The new news.
It's called the New Revised Standard
Part 2.
UE, which I think stands for Updated Edition, but I don't know. But supposedly they've made some good changes.
Were you consulted?
No, I'm not a translation guy. Okay. I'll throw a monkey wrench out there because I like to do this. while the church's use of technology, he says, standing in front of the owl, reaches those who can't be present, does it encourage those who can be here to choose otherwise?
Yes.
My answer is yes.
Well, yeah, it does, but
Is
it
that good or
does,
bad?
it does reach people who can't be here though.
But is that good or bad?
That's my whole
Or
point.
is it neither?
It's both and, my opinion, but not everybody would agree with that. And what sort of spiritual formation will happen when it occurs online exclusively? So I'm thrilled that people on Sunday yesterday who can't be here, either by distance or health or whatever it is, can be here electronically. I'm worried as a theologian about people who say, oh, this is great, I'll just wear my PJs. But I'm a dinosaur, I'm an old theologian.
We could just say you could wear your PJs for church.
You don't get the community if you're not in the pews, and if you're not interacting with people.
But some
I know, but there are young people who say, oh, I have very authentic community online.
Yeah, right.
Now you're exposing.
When we're no longer recording,
I fully admit I'm a dinosaur.
when we're no longer recording, I will tell you a story. Okay, so what kinds of things require speed, slowness? How would you rate your single tasking? What do you think about social justice? How are you processing? Anybody on any of that?
I think this, what we're doing here is a pretty good example of searching for the spiritual. So, I mean, we come here with a sense entranced, enlightened, engaged, curiosity, you know, and kind of pretty much childlike innocence. So I think that's we're doing what you're talking about.
Mhm.
I mean, we're taking time out. We could be watching Monday Night Football, you know. And,
But in a setting like this too, we've got the interaction with one another, and with Mike, you don't get that.
so I didn't-
You're sitting at home in your PJs watching, right? But here we get the interaction with one another and with Mike, and you don't do that. There's more
Well,
elderly
see,
woman than I.
One of the things we've thought about, I mentioned this at the elder deacon meeting, is what if the people who are watching worship online, what if we had somebody who was tweeting with them or texting with them? There are churches that do this, where during the sermon or during whatever, they'll say, oh, I've always loved that song that reminds me of such and such. And they have a tech person who's responding to these. And some churches are posting these things and people are interacting with them. And so, you know, I'm not proposing that, but it's interesting.
But, you know, also, in talking about community, some people, and, you know, are more, I need the person-to-person community. I thrive on it. It's what I need. My sister is very much an introvert. So she would be much more comfortable probably watching online. She would get things out of it. But she has her other things that are community, like tutoring refugees, or, you know. So there's not only one way to get, I mean, I can't imagine not wanting to be in the pews. But I know, even though I can't identify with it, I know there are people who can imagine that.
Right, right. Well, yeah, and I quoted my former student who's religion professor who says they're not going back.
Yesterday, to me, was so exciting because there were people there
Right.
that I didn't even know were still alive. And I'm serious, you know, I saw a couple of people, I thought that person had died. I mean, I'm not kidding. And so I loved having so many people there.
Yeah.
Plus, we could be outside and actually see one another.
Yeah.
We need name tags in the sanctuary.
Yes.
Teresa, what are you?
Well, at the risk of sounding like I'm completely off my rockers, I really think there is something physical going on. We're in the same room, something with our atoms, I don't know.
Yeah.
I think there is something happening that cannot be replicated through technology. And if I have one problem with technology, it's that. Why do we think we got so divisive in this country? Because we are rarely in the same room with other people who are not like us anymore. Rarely.
Well, Greg and I just came from, what's the name of it? American Public Square
Oh, yeah.
event, which is why we're not appropriately dressed for this. And
I was
that's,
just thinking how elegant.
Yeah.
it was, and I was,
yeah.
digging in my teeth.
But that's exactly what they're trying to do, is to get people in the same room with different ideas to talk to each other without yelling at each other, to have civil conversations. And
Yeah.
I'm kind of excited about it, to be
Yeah.
honest.
Yeah. All right, so here's Taylor's predictions after 1,000 pages. The dominant secularization will become less plausible, but not disappear.
What's that mean?
I mean, you're an attorney, you can figure this out. It's going to fade, this secularization trend will become less plausible. It's not going to fade. There will be people who start to question it and say, I don't know, this disenchanted worldview, it's not all that I thought it would be. They kind of long for Camelot or Eden, whatever you want to call it. But the second one, to me, if you take these two together, but living in the immanent frame, remember that one means where what you see is what you get. This is a disenchanted world, live with it. That's just going to intensify feelings of a wasteland. So if you take the two together, he's saying people are going to feel more and more like empty with this being all there is. And at the same time, this secularization narrative, this disenchanted worldview, it's going to fade, but it's not going away. So again, they say the ship has sailed. We're not going back. We're not going back. There's not a religious revival going to happen. You know, we had two great awakenings in American history. That's not going to happen. And if it did happen, it's just going to be a tiny little blip. It's going to be a back page story. It's not going to change the country. Yeah, there'll be maybe more people go to church, but majority of people will be like, can't you hear about those crazy people in Kansas City? I don't know what happened there.
Well, it's my view, world events can change that.
Yeah, maybe. I don't know. I mean, some people said 9/11 is going to bring everybody back, and church was pretty big on 9/16, but it hasn't been since. Yeah.
Well, I think it'll be interesting to see post-pandemic when people aren't scared to get out in public, because there are still some people who are scared to interact with other people. What a difference that makes. Because, you know, if you look at the suicide rates, if you look at the drug addictions, if you look at the alcohol use in the last year and a half, all of those things have skyrocketed. And I think some of that is because we're not having the kind of community that people need
So you
to have.
think that'll bring people back to church?
I don't, maybe, I mean, I don't know, but I think it
Well,
might.
if the trend was moving away from it, some people say the pandemic could reverse that, like you're saying maybe, and others say, it's just going to speed it up. That we look for alternative communities or whatever, you know, or we drink
Well,
ourselves.
something isn't working clearly.
Right,
I mean,
right. Well, seeing if you live in a disenchanted world and you say something's not working, well, what's the answer? Well, there's technology. I have an app for that, and there's specialists who can help you with that. But the answer of religion may not be as attractive.
except Zoom meetings, which is what everybody was doing during the
Right.
pandemic, supposedly to build a community. I can't tell you how tired I am. If I never had another Zoom meeting, I would be absolutely fine with that.
Yeah, I would too. Remember, I retired from teaching because it was going online.
Although it was interesting because I heard on something on NPR about 2 or 3 weeks ago that said that in actuality, the suicide rate has gone down, not up.
Wow.
Which I found very surprising. And in fact, the people that were they had a person from both campuses in Missouri from the suicide prevention networks, and they were both absolutely shocked with the figures of that.
Yeah,
And really didn't have a very good explanation for why they were going down, but they did.
Huh. So I brought these questions up last week about, what hinders flourishing, what aids it. There is one book I would recommend. I found it to be the most helpful and accessible. You can see the title there, The Art of Living for a Technological Age, but it's the preposition. I was kind of disappointed they didn't do more with the preposition, because I thought, well, now that's an interesting choice of words to not say in, but for a technological age. I was kind of surprised he didn't do more with that, but it's a good book. It's not big, it's not terribly hard. Okay, so any last thoughts or takeaways, questions, thoughts, whatever?
Right, when are you gonna turn off the recording so you can tell us the story?
I'll tell you when we sign off. No offense to those of you out there in Cyberland, but I don't want this recorded.
Well, you were true to your word because you didn't present us with any answers.
Hey, I tried. I tried. Read poetry, that's an answer.
Well, that's true. That's true.
Golly, I feel terrible now.
There are so many fascinating things that are going on in the world. We can certainly live in the wasteland, but we never hear about it. Science is absolutely unbelievably great now. There's a right kind of outlook on everything, and maybe that will create an awakening, of some sort. But I'm so disappointed that we never hear about things like that. You really have to search and dig, and you have to find these very exotic kind of books and, hard reading, in order to figure this stuff out. And, it's very frustrating because in that stuff is enlightenment, is entranced, is,
Yeah.
and I think possibly a solution of sorts, or both. No, let's say it's
Yeah.
both.
All right, well, thanks so much. Don't come next week, but 2 weeks from tonight, David May. So
What's
Thanks.
he teaching on now?
archaeology. Yeah. Thank you all for joining.
Thank you, Mike.